Hi everyone, I've switched over to our Dean's conference room. Got a nice whiteboard in here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we get the Gospels. It will certainly apply to Luke, the third Gospel, but it applies to all of them equally. So here we go. We have four Gospels, as I think many of you know, and that marker doesn't work, so maybe we'll try the green one. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, our buddy, and different color, John. These three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because they can be viewed side by side. Much of the material in these three Gospels, if you have some familiarity with the Gospels, if you've read them, much of the material here is repeated in several, or all three of the Gospels. 90% of the Gospel of John is unique to that Gospel. The story of the woman at the well, as an example in John chapter 4, that's only found there. The story of the woman who Jesus restores after the accusation of adultery, it's only found in the Gospel of John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a lot of similar material. So, it used to be the case that interpreters of the Gospels thought that Matthew came first, then Mark, and then Luke. But as a result of historical critical scholarship, a century ago and more, we noticed something, and that is that most of Mark is repeated either in Matthew, in Luke, or in both of them. So that led to the idea that Mark is number one, not in terms of importance, but in terms of chronology, that Mark is written first. This is called Markan priority, and most scholars of the Bible think that this is a fairly good place to land in terms of how the Gospels came to be, that Mark comes first. And then we see that there are places that Matthew has unique material and Luke has unique material, but there are also places where they overlap. And so how do we explain that? Well, the idea is that there is another source that is variously called Q. Q, from the French quelle, and it simply means source. And so the idea is that Matthew and Luke both use this source, which is probably a kind of sayings source. For example, if you are familiar with the Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, we have the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Luke has a similar material in Luke chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is on the Mount, the so-called Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, Jesus is preaching on a plain. So they're kind of different contexts in which the writers are telling us about these sayings of Jesus. In Matthew, the writer says, blessed are the poor in spirit. But in Luke, blessed are the poor. Matthew either adds in spirit or Luke detracts in spirit, but there's a similarity. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the poor. That similarity suggests to us that there may be another source that they're both borrowing from, a sayings source. And by that I mean that Jesus preached over and over again, and oral tradition, memory was different then. Of course, they didn't have laptops, so you actually had to remember what you heard from the rabbi or from the teacher. And so the idea is that this sayings source was eventually recorded somewhere, and that Matthew used Mark and Q, and that Luke used Mark and Q to help construct their Gospels. Now, it's also possible, and I think probable, actually, that Matthew had a so-called M source. In other words, Matthew had something that he was working on. Luke might have had what we might call an L source. Just different, we might say, proto or first sources for what eventually become the Gospels. Let's take Luke and Acts, for example. One of the things that we see in the book of Acts is that we see where Luke switches, for example, in Acts chapter 16, switches from saying they to we. Look at Acts chapter 16, verses 6 through 10, and then look at verse 11. In 6 through 10, it is the third person, they. But in verse 11, I believe it is in Acts 16, the transition switches to we. No longer is it they doing something, but now we are doing something. So it's probable, in my way of thinking, that what happens there is that Luke joins Paul's band at that point, and no longer is he narrating what the sources tell him about Paul's activities, but now he is a part of those activities, and so just naturally records those as we did this or we did that. There's some dispute about that. I think I'm convinced that the we passages in the book of Acts demonstrate that Luke was a companion of Paul's. But be that as it may, when we talk about how the Gospels came to be, John is out here on an island, so to speak, because most of his material is different than what you have in the synoptics. With the synoptics, we tend to think that Mark is first, and that there was this other source that had a lot of sayings of Jesus, and Matthew used those sayings to make one point, Luke used them to make another point, and that both Matthew and Luke probably had other sources, for example, the we sections, and that which preceded it, that helps them formulate what becomes these three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I hope that's been helpful for you. I'm happy to answer any questions about it. Just email me, and we can talk about that. We can have a conversation on the phone, whatever we need to, if this is something that sparks your interest. Okay, I'll see you again soon.